Hello, everybody. Welcome, philosophers. How is everybody today? Hope that you all are having a good day. I certainly am. And one reason why that I can tell you right now is that although it has been a bit of a busy week for me, I did recently finish working on my recent video on the format of the debate show Surrounded. And so that was a big step for me. It ended up taking a lot more time than I thought it would to do the editing and to go through like all the footage and to find clips that looked good and so on. So if you haven't seen that yet, it's on my channel. But anyway, I'm glad now that that is behind me. And also, like, honestly, I'm looking forward to seeing what video I make next, you know? Still haven't fully decided the topic yet, but like with each one that I make, I feel like I learn more about editing, and it's just kind of fun, you know, to be part of the process and to sort of see the new things that I learn with each video. TP Ninja says, trying not to crash out over my exams being tomorrow. Oh, wow. Well, best of luck, TP Ninja. Yeah, I know that can be rough sometimes when it's, especially like the next day. And like if you're trying to sleep or just trying to like take a break and focus on something else, it can be really tough when you have exams the next day. So I totally know what it's like to be in that situation. I don't know if today's live stream will help with the exams, but I hope it does. That would be super cool. If like you get to the exam and there's a question on it about something that we end up talking about in today's live stream, and then you think, yes, I know what this is now. Thank you, Axaeon. Violet says, I'm doing great today. Oh, glad to hear it, Violet. I truly am glad to hear that you're having a good day. Whoa, time to argue. Nice to see you, Axaeon. That's right. That is what we do on these streams, you know? As we are philosophers here, we come here to argue. Not gonna lie, I haven't had time to watch your video, but it looks like it's been doing well. Congrats, I know it took you a long time. Thank you, Tia. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I tell you what, it is so good to have like the gang here to talk about philosophy. And speaking of what we're going to be talking about today, the subject, of course, is logic or reason or critical thinking, whatever way you prefer thinking of it. And the reason why that was the topic for today, the reason why I thought that might be worthwhile to sort of look into is that, of course, this being a philosopher VTuber channel, we talk about philosophy a lot. And really, when you think of it, logic and critical thinking and reason, these are essential to philosophy. And not only that, like I think I would go so far as to say that this is really the core of philosophy. The very heart of philosophy is using our reason, our logic, our capacity for critical thinking, for deep thought and reflection to try to work out the truth to these very deep perennial questions that philosophers like to think about. And so I was thinking that perhaps it would be cool to sort of go into an overview of what critical thinking is and how it works. I got a Pol Science exam, so if this stream has stuff on making arguments, it definitely help. Oh, okay. Well, maybe it will then. That would be a wonderful bit of serendipity if it does end up helping in that way. Now, in saying that this stream is going to be sort of an intro to critical thinking, I want to make something clear. I understand that for pretty much everyone who watches this live stream, or even people who don't, like people who are outside of this current audience, just about everyone already uses critical thinking in some capacity, like in their everyday life already. Like for just about any given decision that you have to make, we have to choose between two things. Those are situations that sort of call on you to use your critical thinking. So these could be situations, like some of them are big decisions, like decisions of what to study, what career to go into. Others are smaller decisions, like if you're having a disagreement with a friend, you're trying to talk it out or figure out like who has the right point of view. So all of those and many more are situations where critical thinking is called for. And so what I want this stream to be understood as is not so much as like unveiling to everyone or trying to unveil to everyone what critical thinking is for the first time. Like, I know this stream is not going to be doing that, but rather the thought is that even for those of us, and actually like for all of us, since it's all of us, I would say, who already regularly use critical thinking in our everyday lives and who are quite good at critical thinking in our everyday lives, I think we often might not have a systematic or comprehensive view of just what critical thinking is. Like, I think it's very common to be, and not just for critical thinking, but for any skill, like a person might be fairly adept at it, but not have a very robust understanding of just what the skill is or just what's involved, what goes into it. And in the case of critical thinking, I think one thing that getting the more systematic view of it can be good for is that, well, it can just be interesting in its own right, for one thing, of just like understanding, okay, like how does reason work? To me, I find that just an interesting thing to think about. But also, I think that even if we're already quite good at critical thinking, I think that understanding in a more systematic way just what goes into it, what the components of logic, of critical thinking are, can help us to become better, even better at being critical thinkers, even better at being philosophers. So that is my hope for this stream. So my hope is that as a result of going over this groundwork together, that you will leave this stream even more prepared to think critically about any topic you choose. So I don't know if you will find that to be the result, but that is at least the aim. Oh, and also I hope that this stream ends up helping you, TP Ninja, with your political science exam tomorrow. So that's another hope for this stream. I actually failed an exam, cough cough 2 of this, so this is going to be quite fun. Well, Teradito, I think it says a lot about you that you can acknowledge that, because for a lot of people, when they think about past experiences in school, past experiences in college, and so on, I think there's a natural reluctance that many people feel to acknowledge times when they failed at something, whether it was an exam or a class or just anything that they were trying. I think that we often are very concerned about, like, oh, what are other people going to think of me if I acknowledge that, this was something that happened to me. But really, when you think about failures like that, like, everybody has them, like, no matter who you are. In fact, I remember one of my first moments in college was during an opening convocation, and all of the professors were gathered on stage, because it was a small liberal arts college, so they were all there. And the president of the college asked them to raise their hand if they had ever failed an exam. And pretty much everyone did. And that just blew my mind at the time, because I thought, like, wow, like, these professors are so smart and they have, had these experiences too. Like, it's not just me and not just my friends. And then he also asked them, the president of the college asked them to raise their hand if they ever failed a class. And here, not quite as many did, but still, I would say it was most of them had failed a class, or at least a very good number of them, like more than you would think, had failed a class at some point in their academic careers. And so I can also say that, like, not to get too sidetracked or too personal on this, but like, one of my early academic experiences is, I believe first grade. First grade was when it was. There was some kind of test or some kind of assignment that we were supposed to just sit in our chairs and do, and I will admit I don't remember the specifics of what the assignment was asking for, but either I didn't understand it or just lost motivation halfway through and, like, went to go play with some game in the corner that I was, like, obsessed with or something like that. But anyway, suffice it to say, I completely failed at whatever the assignment was. And when I got the assignment back and I saw that written in red pen on it, I just was distraught. I thought, oh no, how could I have done this? How could I have failed at this? What does this mean about me? And I was crying very hard about it. And the reason why I remember that story is that the teacher, her name was Miss Cantrell, sat down with me and comforted me and said, "It's okay. This won't matter in 10 years." I believe that's what she said, or maybe it was even 1 year. I think she might have said 10 years though. Don't worry about it. This is going to be fine. It'll be okay. And I remember that made me feel so much better. The fact that she was, sitting with me and sort of helping me feel better about it. And so that always stuck with me. And I think it's important to acknowledge that no matter who you are, you're going to have moments of challenges and moments of failures. And so I think that says a lot about you, Teradiddle, that you can sort of be open about that when for a lot of people, they might not have the courage to do so. Past experiences? No, this was last week, like 3 days ago. Okay, well, I would say the point still stands. No matter if the failure was like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 3 days ago. I think what matters is your present day, not any past failures. I failed my math exam. Oh, sorry to hear that, Violet. Yeah, it's tough failing an exam. It can really wear on you unless one has a sort of strong sense of self-worth, which I think is very important. Dislike math so much it makes me want to rip my hair out. Understandable. I say that as someone who's never been very good at math himself. I understand how that feels. I'm likely to fail an exam regarding workforce planning. I'm unprepared for the formulas involved. Why does HR have so much math? I'm afraid I don't know much about HR, so I can't answer that. I can only say that I sympathize with finding the math difficult. Yeah, formulas, just not my thing either. TP Ninja. Always love hearing your teacher stories. Child Axaeon was so precious. Well, thank you, Tia. That really means a lot. Yeah. And when I think about my childhood, lots of little stories like that. The teacher is so goated. She definitely was. I think part of the reason I remember it is that I mostly remembered her as being pretty distant, but in that moment, like she was there for me. And so that, I guess, maybe surprised me in a way. Walk around your house like a penguin. It works when you feel stressed. Oh, okay. That's actually not a bad idea. I could see that putting one in a kind of different frame of mind if one is feeling stressed. Chibi axe art win. Somebody did make some chibi fan art of me a while back. I shared it on... I hope reposted it on X. I'll have to share it on stream sometime. What would you recommend for getting better at philosophy without reading books? Really just like watching all of my streams and videos just like on repeat. That's like the main way. But no, to speak more seriously, there are a lot of good YouTube videos on philosophy. You can find lectures. And if you want specifics, I can go into that more later. But so yeah, I would say that. There's also lots of good philosophy blogs and blog posts, things on Substack. Actually, for Web of Concepts, this question, I do have, in case it helps, a video about this. Maybe someone can link to it in the chat. Or I guess it might not let you all post links in the chat. Maybe it's just me. But if you look on my channel, Web of Concepts, I have one of my early videos. It's called How to Learn About Philosophy as a Beginner. Or something like that. That might not be the exact title. But it basically deals with this question of, okay, like if you're learning about philosophy on your own and you're not in a class, like how do you do that? And so you might find that video helps you. So I would say if you watch it and have any questions, feel free to post them also like as comments on that video. And I'll be happy to get back to you. It's quite a nice experience. Yeah, I've come to learn to be open. It's simpler to be honest. Shameful, but usually there's still a time for try again. Yeah, at least that's how I like to imagine things, that, like what matters is not the last time you attempted something. It's like if you failed at it, but like, did you attempt it since then, or can you attempt it again? And if you succeed the subsequent time, like I feel like that's really the main thing. Please tell more of your child's story sometime. Okay, I probably will, Violet. I probably will. LMAO, you went the self-promo route. So anyway, I have sort of gotten a bit sidetracked here. Not that it's anyone's fault but my own. Originally, this was going to be a logic and critical thinking stream. I think it's turned into like an encouragement stream and like a childhood story stream. That's maybe a liability of some of my streams. They can easily go that way because I think at heart, despite all of the effort I put into appearing logical and highly rational, I think I am at heart someone who is very sentimental. So without further ado, let us talk about some critical thinking, some logic, and see if we can make some progress on understanding how this all fits together. So welcome back, class. Welcome back, everyone, to my classroom here. Now, as you can see, the blackboard looks a little different from last time. I might not be drawing on it quite as much as before. And the reason is that I know last time it was tricky for me to, well, first of all, I just did not have a good setup on my desk. I had to like draw at an awkward angle, which made my handwriting hilariously bad. And when people were like laughing at it in the chat, like I fully understood, like, yeah, like you're right to be laughing at it. This handwriting sucks. But then it made me think like, okay, what can I do better this time? And there probably will be a few moments in this stream where I do have to write on the board, and I think I have a better setup for doing that now. It should work better. But also there's like a pretty good deal of content, and if I were to try to write it all out manually, I think it would take a very long time. So just to streamline things, I have set it up in this way, a way that you'll see where some of the writing, a good deal of the writing actually, is already sort of done. So that should help us to have this be done in a fashion that does not take all night for everyone. Because I'd feel bad if I made you all stay at this stream all night. Also, that is good advice, TP Ninja, for starters. Unless you enjoy Old English, don't try to read Leviathan right off the bat. It was miserable. Yeah, Hobbes could be a tough read for if you're not into Old English. Free classes, no student debt involved. It's going to be a fun stream. Yeah, at some point I probably will teach actual classes on here. I mean, not with like assignments and grading and things like that, but just with like a series of lectures around a curriculum meant to teach certain classes. No, it's good since you never do pure yapping streams. Quick side note on that. Yeah, I've never been very good at just doing like a simple yapping stream or just chatting stream. Maybe because I always feel like it has to be working towards something. Like I feel like I run out of things to talk about if I try to have the focus be just on chatting about something. Though maybe that's something I could get better at, you know? Maybe that's something an area I could grow in as a streamer. This actually makes it more professional in my opinion, like a PowerPoint on the projector. Yeah, very much so. So, oops, sorry. Did not mean to. I pressed if you want to know what happened, I pressed the wrong button on my stream deck and it for some reason caused the transition to start again. So now let's see if I can press the right one. There it is. Oh yes, our starting point, class. What is critical thinking? What do you all think about this? Without looking it up, think to yourself for a moment. How would you define critical thinking? Like if an alien came to Earth and was wondering about the definitions of various words, had never encountered human language except enough to be able to ask you what the definition of it was, what would you tell this alien? What would you tell them critical thinking is? Because I at least find that to be a question that is maybe more challenging than a lot of people might at first think. It's one of those words that can be a little tricky to define. Like sometimes a person might think, oh, well, isn't it just like thinking hard about something? And you might say, yeah, but then like, doesn't that just raise the question, what is it to think hard about something? So we need a definition that's going to be illuminating. A definition that's going to tell us something important about the heart of critical thinking and not just be giving a synonym. It's one of the classic difficulties of giving definitions in general of big terms like this. So I can tell you the way that I would define it, at least. The way that I prefer to think about it is as essentially evidence-centered thinking. So in other words, a mode of thinking in which we attend to, seek out, and ultimately follow the evidence for a given claim. I know what you might be thinking here. Okay, like, doesn't this definition of critical thinking use the word thinking in the definition? And might that make the definition circular? And so it's true that, yeah, the word thinking occurs in both the definition and the term we're defining. But I think it's also fair to say when we're looking for a definition of critical thinking, we're probably more interested in what the critical means than in the thinking part. And so here I'm just sort of trying to define that sort of part about the critical, that's what's really at issue here. So yeah, this is the definition that I would propose for what critical thinking is. And by evidence, just to clarify a little bit about what I have in mind by that, I would say that evidence is anything that indicates whether a given claim is true or false. Or even if it doesn't indicate decisively, it could be anything that makes it more or less likely for the claim to be true or false. So this means that evidence includes not just things like, scientific evidence or empirical evidence, evidence from our senses. I mean, that can certainly be included. But also it includes more abstract reasoning and arguments as well. So think, for example, things like intuitions or thought experiments. All of that is included under the umbrella of evidence in this definition. And when it comes to definitions of critical thinking, like I see a few of you have proposed some in the chat, which I'll maybe get to talk about in a second. I do just want to point out that I think for something like critical thinking, there's not just necessarily one wording we can use or one definition we can use. Sometimes there are different ways of putting it that ultimately amount to something similar, if not precisely the same thing. And so just to give you an alternative way of putting it, this comes from a critical thinking textbook by Lewis Vaughan called The Power of Critical Thinking. He defines critical thinking as the systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. And I think ultimately, even though this one uses different words, it is not in tension with thinking of critical thinking as evidence-centered thinking. And that's because when we ask, well, okay, like what does rational standards mean? To me, that just sort of reduces to standards based on evidence. So if we're following rational standards in believing something, it seems to me that we are following the evidence for what the belief in question is. So that at least is what I would propose, that there's a kind of natural synergy between these definitions. So I see Tia says like meta-thinking, thinking about thinking. Yeah, I do think that's at least one area where we can apply critical thinking. If we're doing that kind of metacognition, then yeah, that would be one sort of region of thought where we can exercise lots of critical thinking. I'm not sure if I would, and I know you might not be saying this, maybe that was just an example. If somebody were to say, like, is that just what critical thinking itself is? Like, is all critical thinking meta-thinking? One reason I would be skeptical is that I think it's possible to think critically about other things too, like not just one's own thinking. So for example, one might think critically about questions like, what's the right thing to do, or what can I know, or does God exist? And maybe the what can I know is a bad example since that kind of involves our thinking, but for the ones about like the existence of God or other issues in metaphysics or issues in ethics, it seems to me maybe those in some way go beyond just sort of thinking about our own thinking. But I absolutely do agree that that is one kind of key example of where critical thinking can be applied. And also an area where it would do a lot of people a lot of good to think about that more. Like I wish more people engaged in that kind of metacognition, meta-reflection. For me, argumentation, clear definitions, skepticism, and some creativity to come up with possible solutions to problems. Okay, yeah, that's interesting too that you mention all these notions, web of concepts. Because yeah, I think argumentation especially is going to be a key part of it, at least in the way that I present it in what follows. Though, like, the creativity and other parts of what you've mentioned, those are important too. The word thinking comes inside the definition of critical thinking. We must critically think about that. Oh no, we're getting too deep, too many layers here. I've unleashed a can of worms with this definition, haven't I? And there on the board is just a reminder of what I was saying earlier, that I think rational standards we can look at as another way of saying in accordance with the evidence. Now, when it comes to critical thinking, there are certain ideas, certain notions that people sometimes have about it that I think can sometimes discourage the project of critical thinking. And so it might be worth taking a moment just to dispatch some of these myths about the nature of critical thinking. And one of them is that critical thinking makes people too critical or cynical. Not that I think anyone in chat would have this view, but I think people sometimes do. Maybe people who perhaps don't have much exposure to philosophy or much exposure to critical thinking, they might look at the word critical and think, oh, doesn't that mean like criticizing something, like being critical of someone? And to this, I would say that when we're using the word critical in the context of critical thinking, that it means something different. In particular, it does not mean, cynical or mean-spirited or anything like that, but instead, it simply means following the evidence where it leads. So when we're thinking critically, we are thinking in a way that is concerned with what is the evidence that bears on the issue in question. So that's all it is. And you can think critically in that sense without being, a cynical or mean person at all. Like, you can be a very nice person and be, very concerned about following the evidence. Another myth that I think is worth looking at is critical thinking makes people cold and unemotional. So this one might be a little more common, this association between like being a good critical thinker and not having emotions, just being kind of cold and distant. And of course, it's obligatory now to mention, in connection to this point, that the figure that comes to mind for most people when they think about this is Spock from Star Trek. They think, okay, like, who in all fiction is the best example of somebody who is ultra, ultra, ultra into critical thinking? And they think, okay, like Spock, like he's the like smartest guy in the universe or whatever. And then they think, okay, well, Spock, isn't he always like strictly rational, like in control of my emotions and all that? And they think, okay, like maybe that's just what it is to be a critical thinker, or maybe that's at least a consequence of being a critical thinker, is that you lose touch with your emotions, that you become cold and unemotional. Now, on this point, I would say actually a few things. One of them, not to get too sidetracked on Star Trek, but just a point about that example, is that it really doesn't even get the Star Trek lore right, because Spock actually has emotions, human emotions, because he's not just a Vulcan, he's half human. So half human, half Vulcan. He has human emotions. It's just that he has Vulcan control over them. Like, he's very good at controlling his emotions, mastering them, if you will, but there are various points in the show where it's clear that he has emotions. So it's not, I don't think it's accurate to say that he's someone who's fully cold and unemotional. But now, more to the point, if we sort of distance ourselves from that example, if critical thinking really is just about following the evidence where it leads, there's nothing necessarily cold and unemotional about that process. Like, it could be a process that's full of excitement, full of emotion, especially if the issue that you're thinking about, or the issue that you're debating about, is one that is itself exciting, or if it's an issue of personal significance, like as many ethical issues are, for example, then I would say that critical thinking and emotion are not at all at odds with each other. Like, you don't have to be a cold, heartless, distant person to be a good critical thinker. So those are some myths about critical thinking that, I mean, I think it's fair to say most people who maybe study critical thinking or have some familiarity with it probably don't embrace these myths, but I think sometimes just people in the broader culture might. So it's worth saying something about them to hopefully dispel them. Now, a further question about critical thinking that I think is really important to address at the outset is, now that we know what critical thinking is, critical thinking as evidence-centered thinking, Like, why does it matter? And this is worth pondering on too for a second. Like, why does it matter that we follow the evidence in our thinking? Or like, why do you think that critical thinking matters, if indeed it does? It's one of those questions that I think for a lot of people, they might sort of have just a very intuitive and vague sense of like, oh yeah, critical thinking is really important, but it can be a little tricky, at least at first, to specify exactly why, exactly what reasons there are that are favoring it. Thinking critically helps me closer to world domination or other goals I have. Okay. I like that you included world domination as the example of the goal. But yeah, that's a key point, is that if we're going to, like, all of us have goals of some type, things that we're trying to accomplish. And if we follow the evidence in our thinking, then that's going to help us be more sort of practically effective in what we choose to do. And I think that this actually goes along quite well with the point that you just raised, Web of Concepts, is if we look at what it looks like to fail at critical thinking, then I think we start to see more easily why it matters to do it well. It's like one case of failing to do it well is if somebody believes a claim simply because they want that claim to be true. And this is, of course, called wishful thinking. It's very easy to get misled by this. So like if you are, like, let's say that somebody says, hey, like, here's this get rich quick plan that I have. All you have to do is pay me a certain amount of money and I'll make it, I'll have you, I'll have it returned to you like 10 times that amount. Well, if you engage in wishful thinking, you might not, be very critically evaluating that person's claim. You might think like, oh, I'm going to be rich, and maybe then you give them your money and it turns out it was a scam. That's not going to help you achieve the goals that you have. So that's just one example that comes to mind there. Teradito says to stay true to oneself. That's really intriguing, Teradito. Oh, to stay true to oneself with a clear view of the world. Yeah, I see your follow-up there. Yeah, I think there's a lot of room to think about just what the connections are between authenticity and critical thinking. Like, does critical thinking help us be more authentic? And I would like to think that there's a connection between them. Because to me, like, that would just be a really cool, really intriguing philosophical connection if it turned out that, like, critical thinking is either necessary for being fully authentic or, like, helps one to be fully authentic. I can see room for challenges to it. Like, if somebody were to say, well, look, aren't there examples of people, plenty of examples of people who don't exercise much critical thinking, but, like, that just is who they are. Like, they're just maybe not a very thoughtful person, and maybe that's them being authentic. And I can think of a few ways one might respond to that kind of worry, but it seems to me that is, I guess, the kind of worry that would perhaps be posed to this kind of thought about a connection between critical thinking and authenticity. But anyway, no, I think there's a lot of room to think about that point more, and if you do have further thoughts on it, I hope you'll share them. If we didn't think critically, we would just obey others blindly, no? Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Toynbee idea is that if we don't think critically, we're liable to be misled by others who are going to lead us into actions that are harmful to ourselves or harmful to others. So yeah, that's another reason why critical thinking matters so much. Another example of the ways that critical thinking can fail, or rather I should say that one can fail to engage in critical thinking, is just believing a claim because it's accepted by the group around oneself. So just going, oh, okay, like, this is the popular view, I think I'll go along with it. And that can also lead one to all kinds of beliefs that very much will be false and will be counterproductive. And so I think if you ask people, okay, like, is it important to avoid wishful thinking and groupthink? Like, most people in the abstract will say, okay, like, yeah, that seems important. And so that can be one way of thinking about, oh, well, maybe that's part of the reason why critical thinking matters, is it helps us avoid these blunders and these practical difficulties of just going along with whatever the group thinks and being led into falsehood, being led into beliefs that end up doing harm. Maybe someone just values critical thinking for the sake of it. Yeah, and that actually, so you're thinking ahead here, Web of Concepts, because that is the point that I would also like to make, which at this point that's on the board right now is essentially, I guess, what we've already been talking about of being misled by poorly thought out positions or arguments. But there is room to make a further point, which goes all the way back to Socrates. One of the most famous quotations from him is that the unexamined life is not worth living. There, if you're curious, is a picture of Socrates that he recently posted on his Instagram. And this quotation, it's, of course, like any philosophy major knows this quotation, and it's one that is kind of viewed as, I guess, capturing the spirit of philosophy very much, and I think that it does. I don't know if I would say I fully agree with it, or at least I think it's maybe a bit of an exaggeration. Like, I think if somebody presented to me a case of a person who doesn't examine their life, just lives it, but like, let's say the person has a pretty happy life and seems to be doing well by various metrics, they're just not very reflective about their life. I think it would be a little harsh to say that person's life is not worth living, but I at least would say their life would be better if they did examine it, like significantly better. Regardless of whether it makes them happier, I think that there is just some intrinsic value in reflecting on one's life and having wisdom about it, journeying toward wisdom. So I absolutely do agree, Web of Concepts, that just valuing critical thinking for the sake of it, that is something that's worth doing. It is known, as they said in Game of Thrones. That is a great example, Toynbee, of groupthink in action. Somebody said is known. That line always annoyed me on the show because I would think, like, known by whom? Like, how do they know it? I don't think I would have been very popular in their group on that show. I guess for Socrates in particular it was true. Oh yeah, in a way he, I suppose, did end up having to pay the price for going against the group. But yeah, he was willing to pay his life for it, for critical thinking. Now with critical thinking, really when it gets into the components of it, I would say that the most basic component of critical thinking, the foundational element, is arguments. That arguments are what critical thinking is ultimately all about. And I should clarify here that when it comes to the word argument, it's one of those words that, like some of the others we've talked about, is sometimes understood in different ways. In the context of critical thinking, critical philosophy, that kind of thing, argument does not mean like a verbal fight, as it's sometimes used in just broader culture, referring to like an argument that two people had. So when you're arguing with someone in the context of critical thinking, when you're putting forth an argument, it's not necessarily the case that you have to look like this guy, like yelling into a phone at somebody. I mean, you could be putting forth an argument, like a philosophical argument that way, but probably wouldn't be the most effective way of doing it. What an argument in this sense refers to is simply a chain of reasoning. You might also think of it, if you prefer thinking of it this way, as a presentation of evidence. It's like an argument, like presenting a claim and presenting evidence for that claim, evidence that is supposed to lead to that claim. So that's another way of thinking about what an argument is in philosophy. And any argument in this sense is going to have two components. Yep, just two things, essentially, that an argument is made out of. And one of them is the premises. So the premises, if you're not familiar with this word, these are the claims that are together at least supposed to lead us to a given conclusion. So there's a claim that's being defended, and the premises are the claims that sort of are meant to support the claim that one is putting forth. Now I mentioned that that they're supposed to together lead us to the given conclusion, because they don't always lead to a conclusion. Sometimes arguments can be faulty in various ways. Like the premises might be false, or like even if the premises are true, they just might not support the conclusion they're trying to support. But at the very least, the intention in an argument is for the premises to support their conclusion. Now, as all of that suggests, the second component of an argument just is going to be the conclusion. So these are what the premises together show to be true, or at the very least are supposed to show to be true. So the claim that one hopes, okay, I'm going to try to prove this claim or try to at least give evidence for this claim, that is the conclusion. And here, as always in philosophy, I think it helps to give an example, just to help wrap our minds around the notion of what a philosophical argument looks like. So let us look at an example together. In this example, it's going to have two premises and a conclusion. The example, first premise, is if France is a country, then there is at least one country. Which is just impeccable logic, isn't it? Like, you cannot deny this. I would say this first premise is on very solid ground. Yep, big fan of this first premise. And that's really all there is to the first premise. There's nothing, no hidden clauses or anything. So very simple claim that's being made. Let's look at the second premise. So second premise, following up on this, though some of you might have already guessed it. No prizes for guessing what the second premise is going to be. Second premise, France is a country. Whoa, shocker, right? France is a country. Now, those are our two premises. Can you all guess the conclusion? What is the conclusion of this argument going to be? What claim is entailed by these two premises? I don't know if I should give any prizes for guessing this one, chat. But if it's true that France is that if France is a country, then there is at least one country, and it's true that France is a country, well, there is certainly one claim that follows. Therefore, there is at least one country. So that is going to be the conclusion of this argument. So they're here at the top, premises. There at the bottom, the conclusion. I reject the premises because I don't like the conclusion. Okay. So we have a country nihilist here with us in chat. Well, it is true, yeah, if you're going to reject that conclusion, you're going to have to reject at least one of the premises. So, don't know how plausible a view that is, but hey, can always go with it if it seems to be the most plausible view to you. Now, another thing about this example is that you might notice that with these numbered premises, numbered conclusion, it's all in a pretty ordered, pretty regimented form. And this is sometimes called standard form. And all that it means is just when you have a numbered list of premises followed by the conclusion. And so the reason for doing it this way is that putting an argument in standard form can help make its structure clearer and can also help us evaluate arguments. If you're thinking, okay, is this argument a good one? And let's say you think it's not, well, then you can decide, okay, is there a certain premise that I take issue with? Or do the premises together entail the conclusion? You can kind of look at it sort of piece by piece and see how it all fits together. Now, of course, not all arguments that you will encounter in the wild, so to speak, are in standard form, but sometimes taking the time to put an argument in standard form, even if it's not your argument, if it's just an argument that you encounter, in a paragraph that somebody writes, or in a speech that somebody gives, sometimes just putting it into standard form on your own can kind of help you think about it. So it can sometimes be a useful practice. Now, one question that comes up there is, well, okay, let's say you're reading a book and it's just a series of regular looking paragraphs. Most books, unless it's a book written by a philosopher, and even then, not all philosophers do this. Not all philosophers put their arguments in standard form. But most books, most essays, people speaking on TV, speaking in podcasts, doing debates, and so on, when they give arguments, it'll just be a series of regular looking sentences and paragraphs. They won't be in standard form. Which raises the question, well, okay, how do we recognize arguments then? How do we recognize when something is intended as an argument? And the answer is that we look for what we might call indicator words. So indicator words are going to be very important. And these are words, let's just take some that often indicate premises. So some examples would be like because. Like because this thing is true, it follows that this other thing is true. Like because such and such person gives a lot of money, their money to charity, they must be a nice person. So like that would be an example where the because is introducing a premise. Since, again, same thing as because. Since is often used to introduce premises. Not always, but if you get the feeling an argument might be present and it's using since in this way. Like with our previous example, we could say, since France is a country, it follows that there is at least one country. So that would be applying it to that example. For, also again, often used this way. It's a little more poetic perhaps, but if you were to put it this way, you could say, there is at least one country, for France is a country. That would be another way of getting at that same argument. Or for the reason that, again, same idea as before, these indicate sort of what the premises in an argument are. And I want to be clear, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. These are just some examples. You might be able to think of additional indicator words, but these are some of the major ones. Toynbee idea says like an if-then statement in programming. Yeah, I think that, I'm not sure exactly which component you're referring to, but essentially, yeah, like if you're thinking about like a premise and conclusion, then like one way you can sort of capture an argument is like if, and then like combination of all the premises. Like if all these premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Like that's essentially the claim that an argument is making. And meanwhile, some indicator words when it comes to conclusions are words like therefore. So again, for our earlier example, France is a country, therefore there is at least one country. Or thus. Thus can be another word for therefore, for that reason. Or hence. Yeah, sometimes hence might feel a little stilted maybe, or a little formal, but it can work. Certainly can work. So any of these I think would be fine to use as indicator words for a conclusion. Again, this list is not meant to be exhaustive, so you might be able to think of other ones on your own. But these are some of the main ones that you'll find when it comes to words that are often used to introduce conclusions. Me when propositional logic is terrible and we need an entire new field to fix it. Propositional logic is terrible? I'd be curious to hear why you think it's terrible. I know the comment might not have been meant seriously, but yeah, propositional logic, it definitely takes some getting used to. I will definitely give it that. Oh yeah, oh sorry, one more I forgot. Yeah, it follows that. It's another good indicator word or phrase for conclusions. So let's practice a bit, chat. I know we've talked in the abstract about identifying arguments, what arguments are. I'm going to throw some text on the board right now, and I want you all to tell me if it's an argument or not. So y'all ready? Let's see if we can do this. First example, Canada is the world's second largest country by area. So tell me, chat, is this an argument or not? Like if you encountered this statement in a book you were reading, would you think, oh, this is expressing an argument? This one might be a kind of easy example. So just think to yourself now, is this an argument? And hold the answer in your mind, because right now we're going to see what the answer in fact is. And the answer is going to be no. So it's not an argument. This is just a statement. So there's no chain of reasoning here, no claims that are intended as evidence for other claims. It's just making a bare, sort of bald statement. How about this one? Wait just a minute. What do you think you're doing? Oh no. If somebody says this to you, you might start thinking like, oh no, now I'm feeling kind of anxious. But for our purposes, we can ask, is it an argument? So again, just as before, hold the answer in your head. I see Toynbee Idea says holding. Okay, very good. And the answer to this one, whether it's an argument, is going to be also no. Just like the previous one, it's not going to be an argument, because this one is just a question. So just raising a question to somebody, that does not suffice to make something an argument. Here's one that's maybe a little trickier. Those first two examples were a bit easy. Sally is nicer than Bill. Otherwise, why would Steve have told us so? So again, just as before, chat, I ask you, is this an argument or is it not? Could this be an argument, or might it just fail to count as one? While you're thinking about that, I'm going to read what Taradiddle said here. Oh, I mean, formal logic works for machines, but actual language doesn't follow good form. So that's where the theory of argumentation comes from, I think. Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, it is true that when we're putting things like in the notation of symbolic logic or formal logic, then it very much looks different from just ordinary language. And this is something that, a lot of students find confusing when they first encounter it. And I include myself in that group too. Like, it's not a way of putting things that comes naturally to me either. I think there are very few people who find it natural to think in the language of symbolic logic. So yeah, I would agree with that. Informal argument, IDK. Well, I think you're onto something there, Web of Concepts, because it turns out that, yes, this is in fact an argument. Now, it's presented in a way that might seem a little unusual. It's presented as a rhetorical question, but nevertheless, it is an argument here, and that's because there is a chain of reasoning. A chain of reasoning that is at the very least implied by the question. So the conclusion of this argument would be Sally is nicer than Bill, and the evidence, or the premise for it, is that Steve told us so, and also implicitly that Steve is trustworthy. That, like, Steve, is telling the truth in this. Here's another example. Horses are more useful to humans than jellyfish are because horses can be used for transport. So think to yourself now, is that going to be an argument? Kind of a strange sentence when you think about it. Like, I'm not sure what context would be leading someone to compare horses and jellyfish for their usefulness to humans. But we can just roll with it and imagine, okay, maybe this is like weird conversation. And so for this question, like, is it an argument or not? The answer is going to be also yes. Much like the previous example. And the same as before, that this is a chain of reasoning here. And to show that it's a chain of reasoning, we can actually go ahead and put this argument into standard form. So if you think for yourself, or think to yourself for a moment, what way would there be of putting this argument into standard form? That is, if we wanted to number the premises and the conclusion and put them in kind of an ordered list, how might we do that, chat? Can we put this strange argument about horses and jellyfish into standard form? Or maybe an easier question than that is, let's just start with premise number 1. Like, what would the first premise of this argument be? Because, like, if anything is argument, it's going to have at least one premise. So here we can ask, okay, what would the first premise be of this argument? And with this argument, as with most other arguments, there's not just going to be necessarily one way of wording it. But one way that I like, at least, that I'm going to share with you now, and you all, if you have other ways of putting it that you might prefer, you can note it in the chat. But the way that I like to think of this argument in standard form is as saying, first premise, if one animal can be used for transport while another cannot, then the first animal is more useful to humans than the second one is. So true, that claim is not explicit in the argument's original form. However, that doesn't matter because it's implied. It's an implicit premise. And this is something that's very common in arguments that you encounter in ordinary language. They won't necessarily put all their premises explicitly. They're going to be premises that are assumed, premises that they're relying on, but only in an implicit way. And so when we're putting arguments in standard form, one thing that we try to do is capture any of these crucial assumptions, any of these crucial implied premises that an argument is relying on. So if that's the first premise, then the second one is actually going to be a little bit easier. The second one is going to be horses can be used for transport, while jellyfish cannot. Actually, to capture the second premise, it would have been a little clearer, like if in the original sentence they had said, like, because only horses can be used for transport, where the only is like just comparing them to jellyfish. But still, the idea there seems, broadly speaking, clear enough. So from these two premises, it follows that horses are more useful to humans than jellyfish are. So now we have that argument kind of mapped out in standard form. And so if someone were to challenge it now, it would be much easier for them to think, okay, like this is the premise or premises that I don't like, or here's why the premises don't support that conclusion. Like now we could have that debate more easily than just looking at the original sentence and sort of relying on these implied premises. Further example, I am disappointed at how disposedly people treat their friendships these days. It used to be that people would check in on their friends all the time. Now it seems that friends don't reach out to each other all that much. What say you, chat? Argument or not an argument? And as you're thinking about that, I will admit, I think this is the trickiest example so far. This one, like a lot of the examples I'm giving here, comes from a logic textbook that I have. And they gave this example, and I thought it was pretty good. You see, Web of Concepts says argument probably. Okay, yeah, why argument probably? I mean, maybe that's right. I'm not saying just yet whether it's right or not. But what do you all think? Argument or not? So hold whatever answer you're thinking in your head. So I'll give some examples to support the opinion. So I guess there the question that I would have, like just as a follow-up to kind of flesh out this view is, what exactly is the opinion being supported? Like, is the opinion that the person is disappointed at people treating their friendships disposably? It's like, if the opinion is just that, like we might say, well, is that really an opinion, or is it just like an expression of emotion that somebody has? On the other hand, I think we could say, like, just to kind of see where you're coming from here, that like if the opinion is just people treat their friendships disposably these days, like, yeah, it seems like that's putting forth an opinion. And then the claims that are given after that could be used or seen at least as examples to support that claim. And so I think that way of thinking about it makes sense. Really, for this one, if you're curious about what the logic textbook that I have says about it, that textbook says, no, it's just a series of statements. And I think that the textbook's reasoning here is that the first sentence in this example is just somebody like venting frustration, basically. And then the other sentences are just kind of continuations of sort of venting that frustration, but like they're not sort of intended to be taken as a chain of reasoning. And so, like, sure, these statements are connected, they're about the same thing, but I guess the thought that that the textbook author has is that, like, it's not enough for a series of statements to be just connected to form an argument. They have to be connected in the right way, namely as premises leading to a conclusion. Now, that said, I actually do think there is a case to be made for the answer that you're giving here, web of concepts. Like, that is that one could understand this as an argument if we understand the person as making the claim that people treat their friendships disposably these days. Like, that's their conclusion. And maybe the claims that follow are sort of being presented as evidence for that conclusion, like as premises. So, like, here's my first premise, or I guess, yeah, the major premise there would be, like, it seems that friends don't reach out to each other all that much. So yeah, this one, I think maybe it's a little ambiguous. Like, I don't think there's necessarily a clear-cut answer. I can see room for some disagreement on this, but at the very least, under the book's interpretation, the thought is, like, yeah, the person is maybe just sort of venting their emotions. Toynbee asks, can an opinion be an argument if it is worded correctly? Let me just see if I'm understanding the question. So I'm inclined to say yes, though it also seems to me as if maybe the question is assuming that, like, there's some reason to think an opinion would normally not count as an argument, or maybe, like, the default is to not count opinions as arguments, but, like, maybe in certain special cases an opinion can count as an argument, like if it's worded correctly. If that is the assumption, and I don't know if it is, so I apologize if I'm misunderstanding you, Toynbee idea, but if that is the assumption, then I would say, yeah, that's not the way that I tend to think of it. I think that just when I read the word opinion, and also by my understanding, this is the way I think most philosophers would read it, an opinion is just something that somebody thinks. It's just like something that you believe is true. Like, if you think something is true, then you have, an opinion that that thing is true. And so, yeah, I mean, any argument is going to involve putting forth opinions that you have about various things. And so, yeah, there's no tension at all. If we understand opinions that way, there's no tension at all between thinking that something is an argument and that argument is, filled with opinions that, the speaker has. I mean, it's that thing where you have to use a pinch of creativity. They hate that because technically you're using outside the text info. Yeah, sometimes I know sometimes, yeah, instructors don't like it when you use outside info, but for this one, I think we really do have to use some creativity, and also just to realize that, like, it's often ambiguous in the real world whether something is meant as an argument or not. And so we can look at this example kind of in the same light. Now, when it comes to evaluating arguments, this is also, of course, going to be a very important question, because we want to know not just, like, what an argument is, but, like, how do we tell if an argument is a good argument? And there are several components that go into this, like, how to evaluate an argument. And the first one is something called validity. Those good arguments have to be, at the minimum, valid. And what it means for an argument to be valid, in this sense, is going to be something I'll introduce in a moment. But first, before I talk about that, there is a distinction that I have to make between two kinds of arguments. And the first kind is what's known as inductive arguments. These are arguments that are intended to provide merely probable or probabilistic support to their conclusions. They're not conclusive support. They're not meant to entail their conclusions, but just meant to make the conclusions more likely. And the classic example of an inductive argument, this is just a simple one-premise argument. The premise is, the sun has risen every day so far. Conclusion, therefore the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, the reason why this is an inductive argument is that, sorry, I jumped the gun there. The reason why this is an inductive argument is that just from the fact that the sun has risen every day so far, it does not follow, like, strictly speaking, it does not follow that the sun will rise tomorrow. Like, for all we know, it could be that today was the last day the sun ever rose, and tomorrow, like before the sun gets to rise, maybe like aliens come along and blow it up, or maybe some other weird space phenomenon happens and, you know, prevents the sun from rising. Strictly speaking, that is a logical possibility. Like, there doesn't seem anything contradictory about that. And so it seems like we can't really rule it out that that's going to happen. Nevertheless, it just seems very, very likely that the sun will rise tomorrow, simply given the fact that it's risen every day so far. So that's why this is an inductive argument. The premise does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, but it does strongly support it. So in a fuller critical thinking course, we would be looking at inductive arguments in more detail. I'm mostly going to set them aside for today's session, though, because there's a lot more we could say about them. But in today's session, I'm going to be focusing on deductive arguments, which are the second kind of argument that there are. So deductive arguments are going to be ones that, unlike inductive arguments, attempt to provide conclusive support for their conclusion. So this is the goal of a deductive argument, is not merely to make the conclusion more probable, but it's to get a conclusion that is entailed by the premises. Or for another way of putting it, it's that if the premises are true, there's no way for the conclusion to be false. And that is actually what validity is. So if a deductive argument is valid, so valid here being a somewhat technical term that has a very specific meaning in philosophy. A valid deductive argument is one in which, if the premises are true, there's no way for the conclusion to be false. So we sometimes call validity truth-preservingness. Valid arguments are truth-preserving in that plug in true premises and like it's guaranteed that the conclusion will be true as well. And that alternative formulation there is just the one I gave earlier, that in a valid argument, it's impossible for all the premises to be true, yet for the conclusion to be false. And of course, naturally, as you might have already guessed, if there's a deductive argument that falls short of this, so one where it's possible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false at the same time, well then that argument is an invalid argument. And the key clarification that I would like to make here when it comes to just how to understand validity is that valid is not a synonym for true, which I think it can sometimes be tempting for people to use it that way. They think like, oh, okay, isn't just a valid argument an argument that's true, or like one where the premises and conclusion are true? And so it's important to understand that's not what it means. All that it means for an argument to be valid is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true as well. So there's something sort of inherently conditional about the claim being made when we claim that an argument is valid. Also, just more generally speaking, like really it doesn't even make sense to call an argument itself true or false. Like an argument can be valid or invalid, but it can't be true or false. Only like the premises can be true or false and the conclusion can be true or false. But when you're thinking about arguments, take care to try not to slip into thinking of the argument itself as true or false, but instead as valid or invalid, at least if it's a deductive argument. So here's some example, or here is at least one example to illustrate a valid argument. I'll give an example of an invalid argument later, but first, for one that's valid, let's just just go with an easy example. We'll take the earlier one I gave of if France is a country, then there is at least one country. France is a country, therefore there is at least one country. Now this is valid because like if both of those two premises are true, like in here we don't even have to ask if they are true. We can just say like, okay, let's assume that they're true. Let's just start by like imagining that these two premises are true. Well then there's no way the conclusion could be false. The premises just guarantee, that is, if the premises are true, like that just guarantees that the conclusion is true. So that is a very easy example of a valid argument. Part of what makes it easy, I guess, just is that the premises are obviously true and the conclusion is obviously true. But not all examples are this easy. Sometimes valid arguments can be a little trickier to recognize. Because not all examples will be, of valid arguments will be ones where the premises and conclusion are true. So here's an example of what that looks like. If you're curious, like, okay, what would a valid argument look like when it has false premises and a false conclusion? Can you think of any examples? Like if you just think of it right now kind of on your own. You come up with an example of an argument that is valid, but in which the premises and the conclusion are both false. So think about it for a moment, kind of on your own. While you're doing that, I'm going to start introducing an example of just such an argument. So the example might seem a little silly at first, but it's one that I like to use because I think it makes an especially clear illustration of how an argument can have false premises and a false conclusion, but still be valid. So here's the first premise. If the sky is green, then penguins rule the earth. Second premise, the sky is green. Conclusion, therefore penguins rule the earth. So this might seem, again, kind of a silly or absurd argument, but if we ask, is it valid? Then the answer is yes. It absolutely is a valid argument. And that's because, again, it doesn't matter for validity whether the premises or conclusion are true or false. It just matters that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true as well. And in this case, there is no world where both of those premises are true. This is where it's true that if the sky is green, then penguins rule the earth, and it's true that the sky is green, without it being true that penguins rule the earth. So those premises do indeed entail the conclusion. If the sky is blue, then cats hate you. My example was getting close. That actually is kind of funny that we ended up thinking of kind of similar territory for the examples there. I'd feel really bad if cats hated me. I guess some cats do, or some cats are just indifferent. But yeah, no, that's great minds think alike, evidently. Pteroditto. So just to kind of recap this part, remember, for telling whether an argument is valid, we just start by assuming that the premises are true. Then ask ourselves, okay, now, is there any way, under that assumption, the assumption of the true premises, for the conclusion to be false? And we see in this case, there is not. So the way to determine whether an argument is valid is, right, see, like, is there any possible world, like any possible scenario? Doesn't have to be an actual scenario, but just any possible scenario where the premises are true, but the conclusion is not true. And if there is, then it's an invalid argument. Because remember, deductive arguments are trying to conclusively establish their conclusion. They're trying to entail the conclusion. So even if there's just one counterexample, that shows that the argument is invalid. Otherwise, though, the argument is valid after all. And sometimes this can be tough, by the way. So if we just go back for a bit, sometimes it can be, like, especially if it's an argument that you are strongly opposed to. Like maybe it's an issue that you just have a very committed opinion on, and somebody is arguing for the other point of view. Then it can be a little tricky to recognize if somebody is putting forth a valid argument for that opposing view. But one thing to keep in mind is that you can perfectly well grant that an ideological opponent is putting forth a valid argument for their view. Because just saying that the argument is valid, that does not commit you to accepting its conclusion. You can still reject the conclusion of a valid argument. all that you have to do is just reject at least one of the premises. So if you're going to be consistent in your view, then rejecting the conclusion of a valid argument commits you to rejecting at least one of that argument's premises. So for some examples of invalid deductive arguments, here's one that I was recently thinking of. Axaeon is an elephant. All elephants are pink. Therefore, eagles are orange. So here are the premises, and they just fail to entail the conclusion. Like, even if it were true that Axaeon is an elephant, which I'm not an elephant, I am an orb, temporarily taking human form. But even if it were true, and if it were true that all elephants are pink, like, it could still be the case that eagles are not orange. Like, eagles wouldn't have to be orange if those two premises are true. So that's an easy example to see why it's invalid. Easy because it involves false premises and a false conclusion. But not all invalid arguments are like this. Some invalid arguments are going to have true premises and a true conclusion. I want to show you an example of what that looks like. Can you all think of an example just on your own briefly if you try to come up with at least the start of one? An invalid argument, but where the premises are true and the conclusion is true. So that makes it a little trickier, that provision there. The examples always mention the sky for some reason, I think. Okay, yeah, I guess I do think of the sky a lot when I think of examples. Maybe just because the sky is so big. I think, like, okay, it's like one of the first things that comes to mind. But yeah, I think you're raising a fair point there. So the example that I would give of an invalid argument that has true premises and a true conclusion goes like this. Premise 1, we are currently in a live stream. Whether that's as a presenter in my case or as a viewer in your case. So we're all currently participating in this live stream. 2, if someone is in a live stream, then they're using the internet. And again, that's true whether you're the live streamer or a viewer. You gotta be using the internet for it. Conclusion, we are currently discussing critical thinking. Okay, also true, like all of these are true, but it's still an invalid argument. Because these premises do not lead to the conclusion. They do not entail the conclusion. Like, really, they have very little to do with the conclusion. So another way of putting it is that the conclusion just fails to follow from the premises. And we know that it fails to follow from the premises because if we ask, could it be the case that the premises are true while the conclusion is false? Well, the answer there is clearly yes. Like, for instance, a case in which, like, we were currently in a live stream and therefore using the internet, but maybe it's like a live stream just about like gaming or something, or like just chatting, but like not about critical thinking. Like, that's clearly a possible scenario, which shows that these premises do not entail this conclusion. So the broader lesson there, so I got so caught up in explaining the point, I forgot to put it on the board, but yes, there you can see the points about why the argument is invalid, about how the premises fail to entail the conclusion. But the broader lesson, I think, with this example is that there's kind of a parallel here, in that a valid argument can very easily have false premises and a false conclusion. But likewise, an invalid argument can have true premises and a true conclusion, which all just goes back to the point that what validity and invalidity are about is not so much like, is the conclusion true or are the premises true? It's more about what relationship do the premises have to the conclusion? Is the argument truth-preserving? Do the premises entail the conclusion? Are they such that if the premises are true, there's no way for the conclusion to be false? So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about valid arguments. Now, one thing about valid arguments is that really it's more a matter of the structure of an argument than its content. It is whether an argument is valid or not. And so in just a moment, I would like to show you some examples of argument forms, argument structures that are always going to be valid. I'm just going to get a drink of water first because I've been talking a lot. Okay, that's better. All right, okay that they don't relate. I was trying to remember something like if the ground is wet, then we'll slip. We slip, so the ground is wet. I don't remember well. If A, then B. B, therefore A is invalid. Yes, that's correct, Teraditto, and that's a point we'll be touching on in a moment. But yes, that structure of argument that you've sketched out in kind of symbolic form there, that would be an example of a fallacy that's known as affirming the consequent. So yeah, that's a really good example. We'll touch on that here in a bit. So again, as I was saying earlier, for validity, it's really not so much a matter of the content of an argument. It's more about like what's the structure? How do the premises and conclusion fit together? And as a result of that, there are certain forms that you'll commonly see, like ways you can put an argument together, sort of templates. You might think of them as templates, where if an argument has a given template, it's just guaranteed that the argument will be valid, regardless of what the argument's content is. And so I'm not going to show you today all of the valid argument forms, because there are infinitely many of them, but here are some of the most common ones that you'll find in philosophy. And the first is modus ponens. Modus ponens. And here's how modus ponens goes. It's kind of similar to the one that you just sketched, Teraditto, but also importantly different in a way. If P, then Q. So that's going to be the structure of the first premise, or at least one of the premises in a modus ponens. Doesn't matter so much the order of the premises. And here P and Q can stand for any sentence, any proposition. So that's going to be the first premise, if P, then Q. Second premise is P, where again, any proposition just has to be the same in the first premise and in the second premise. Like the P there has to be whatever premise or whatever sentence you use, whatever proposition you use, you just have to sort of repeat it in a way that it makes the structure all match out right. So if those are the two premises, then conclusion is going to be Q, therefore Q. And that's going to be the case regardless of what you plug in for P and for Q. So again, P and Q, any statement, any proposition. So see, Web of Concepts asks, what if you reject modus ponens? Yeah, then you might run into some difficulties. I mean, there actually is an interesting debate about this, and it's one that I will admit I'm not an expert on myself, but I know sometimes there are potential counterexamples that one might put forth where people have wondered, at least some people have wondered, like, hey, might this be a counterexample to modus ponens? We don't have to worry about that too much right now, though I can maybe try to talk about it a little more if people are really curious. But suffice it to say, at the very least, the standard view is that like any argument that's put in the form of a modus ponens is going to be a valid argument. And here's an example of what a modus ponens looks like. This is actually, just to not go too far back into my own history, but when I was taking my own first philosophy class, this was the example that my philosophy instructor used to illustrate modus ponens. And now I pass it on to you, chat. First premise, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. Second premise, it is raining. Conclusion, therefore, the ground is wet. Wonderful argument, right? It just all fits so well together. And of course, this is going to be a valid argument, not just because it's a modus ponens, but just like if you think about it, it's impossible for both of these premises to be true, yet for the conclusion to be false. And we see it matches up to the modus ponens structure precisely. So here the P stands for the proposition it is raining. That's what we've plugged in for the P. Q, the ground is wet. And the structure maps out just the same. And we see that it is, in fact, a valid argument. The ultimate debate move is to adopt fuzzy logic when you're losing. Yeah, I guess if you're playing dirty in a way, then yeah, you could just be like, if you're losing an argument, you could just think, oh, well, maybe I'll just adopt some, non-standard logic, and maybe then I can make my position come out right. Not to say that, a non-standard logic is wrong, just if one's only motivation for adopting it is to not lose a debate, then yeah, that is kind of playing dirty. But perhaps that's, if we take a particularly cynical view of the game of philosophy, I suppose some would say maybe that's what we have to do sometimes. So these two always confuse me, screw conditional and biconditional. Yeah, well, you might be happy to know, Teradito, I don't think we'll be doing many biconditionals in today's stream. But we definitely are going to be talking about conditionals, so get ready. Now here's a point of caution, and this actually also gets back to your earlier point, Teradito, your earlier question. So here is something that is not a valid argument form. First premise, if P then Q. Second premise, Q. Conclusion, therefore P. And when you put it in the abstract like that, it might at first be a little tough to see why this is not a valid argument form. Like, it might look valid, or you might think like, hey, isn't that pretty much just the same thing as modus ponens? It's like, what's the problem with this? Well, the problem can be seen when we look at a filled out example with it. So let's, in the vein of our earlier example, plug in some things about raining and the ground being wet. Premise number one, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. Okay, that's going to be our if P then Q. Second premise, Q, the ground is wet. Conclusion, therefore P, therefore it is raining. We see there's a problem with this argument, right? Because this conclusion just does not follow from these premises. Is it could be true that if it is raining, then the ground is wet, and it could be true that the ground is wet, but it doesn't follow that it's raining. Like, the ground could be wet for some other reason. For example, like maybe someone spilled a bucket of water on the ground and that's why it's wet, but it's not, raining outside. Or maybe someone was just spraying a hose on the ground and that's why it's wet. It doesn't have to be raining, for that to be the case. So we can see that these premises fail to entail the conclusion, and that is why this is known as a fallacy. So any argument with this form is a fallacy, which is a mistake in reasoning. And this particular fallacy is known as affirming the consequent. I'll say more in a moment about why it's called that, but affirming the consequent. So first, just a side note about fallacies is sometimes the word gets used a little loosely, and people will use it to mean like any belief that's false. But strictly speaking, a fallacy is not just a false belief. Like, if someone might be using a fallacy, but somehow just like by sheer luck even end up at a true belief. So fallacy is less about like whether the belief is that you arrive at is true or false. It's more about, has there been a mistake in reasoning? And we see in this case there is. Like, even if it's true that it is raining, like if it just happens to be true that it's raining, it's not because this argument shows it. Like, it would just be true by sheer luck. If somebody were making this argument and it turned out to be raining, the fact that it's raining would not be sort of entailed by these premises. So that's what would make it a fallacy. Now, if you're wondering why is it called affirming the consequent, this has to do with the structure of conditionals. So here I'm going to just attempt to write something on the board. I'm going to try to do so in a way that's maybe a little clearer than my previous live stream. But if we... Actually, sorry, it looks like my iPad must have desynced. I'm going to try to resync it. Harry's PC. Oh no, have I doxed myself? Oh no, chat. I didn't mean to dox myself. Oh no, what am I gonna do now? This is so scandalous. Yeah, I think what happened is I wasn't using my iPad for long enough, and it must have sort of disconnected. I was going to draw sort of a diagram of the sentence on the board and then show you like which parts are the antecedent and which are the consequent. But alas, it looks like, yeah, having some trouble with it. It's not really loading that well. Might have to restart my iPad program. If it doesn't work in a second, I will just have to forego that part and hope no one's too disappointed. But I was hoping to do some writing on the board for today's session because I kind of enjoy it, you know? Like it's fun. It's fun to write on the board, but this screen sharing program I have like with my tablet is actually like really kind of finicky. So I might have to find a better one for next stream. Docs. Hi, Harry. Thank you, Toynbee. Hello. OMG, that was unintentional? Haha. I mean, it kind of was, yeah. So, luckily, I'm not a VTuber who's secret about their identity, or I would actually be like freaking out right now. Okay. Yeah, it just says starting receiver. Might have to restart the whole okay, here we go. I think I might have gotten it, chat. It says it's loading the screen. Okay, there it is. Yay. So you can see there. Okay, now I've drawn it. Don't worry, we won't tell anyone you're Harry. Okay, thank you, yeah. Anyone who's watched my debut stream would know, but it means a lot to me that you will not tell anyone. Thank you, Web of Concepts. So take our earlier sentence that we were looking at. So if it is raining, then the ground is wet. This is going to be what's known as a conditional. So a conditional being any kind of like if-then sentence like this. There we go. So if it is raining, then the ground is wet. And any conditional is going to have two components. So one of those components is going to be this one right here, which we call the antecedent. And this is just what follows the if. So the if clause. So in this case, the antecedent is it is raining. Now the other component of a conditional is going to be what comes after the then. So in this case, it's going to be the ground is wet, and we call that the consequent. So the consequent of a conditional. And just to kind of wrap it all up together here to show how it all fits, like this entire statement, the sentence as a whole, this is known as a conditional statement, conditional proposition. Also, can you draw the utility monster again? I missed them. Well, I'm sure that means a lot to the utility monster that you miss him so much. Maybe just like a really short drawing. I'll just kind of see. There's his teeth. Yeah, there he is, see? Though I think I might have anthropomorphized him a little bit too much. He looks maybe a little too human in this case. But oh well. It was the best I could do in a few seconds. So to go back to my earlier point, the reason why this fallacy is called affirming the consequent. So if you remember earlier, the mistaken reasoning shown here on the board, affirming the consequent, is that if we look back at the structure of that argument, so that if P then Q, Q therefore P, the second premise just flat out states Q, and that's the consequent of that conditional that we started with. It affirms that consequent in order to conclude that the antecedent is true. And that is a mistake, and so that's why we call it affirming the consequent. So that vocabulary can be useful if you're ever just thinking about conditionals and how they work, which is also going to help us with one of the other valid argument forms that we look at in a moment. But first, this actually is not going to be one that involves conditionals, at least not directly, but there is another valid argument form that I think is equally important called disjunctive syllogism. Disjunctive syllogism. Now the name might sound a little technical or a little scary, but it's actually not as scary as it sounds. So disjunctive syllogism, like a modus ponens, is going to have two premises. So first premise, in this case, is going to be P or Q. It's going to be our or statement. And then second premise, not P. Conclusion, therefore Q. Could also run it like if you had P or Q, not Q, therefore P, like that would also be a disjunctive syllogism. And this one I think is pretty intuitive, like it makes a lot of sense why disjunctive syllogism would be true. Just to give a concrete example of it, we might have our first premise, she ordered soup or she ordered salad. Second premise, she did not order soup. Conclusion, oh, what's it going to be? Therefore, she ordered salad. Okay, right? Pretty easy, pretty natural, pretty intuitive. And if you're thinking, okay, like why is it called disjunctive syllogism? Well, the answer is that the or statement there, the P or Q, that's known as a disjunction. Like any statement that centers around an or like that, we call those disjunctions. And a syllogism, meanwhile, is simply a two-premise argument like the ones that we've been looking at. It's like modus ponens is also an example of a syllogism. We're going to be looking at another one in a moment, but that's why we call this one disjunctive syllogism. Now, a further valid argument form has some parallels to modus ponens, and it is going to be called modus tollens. Modus tollens. This is one of my favorite ones. I really like modus tollens. The way that modus tollens goes is first premise, if P then Q. So starting off in a way very similar to modus ponens, but second premise is going to be not Q. It's going to be rejecting the consequent of that conditional to get the conclusion of not P. So if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. If we want a concrete example to illustrate what this looks like, we can use a variation of our previous example about raining and the ground being wet. So what that would look like is premise 1, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. Premise 2, the ground is not wet. 3, conclusion, therefore, it is not raining. If we see quite clearly that's a valid argument. There's no way you could have both of those premises true, but the conclusion come out false. So any argument that is in the form of a modus tollens is going to be valid. Point of caution, though, there is a closely related argument that turns out to be a fallacy. So kind of like, you know how with modus ponens, we had the fallacy of affirming the consequent? Well, here's a fallacy that might sometimes get mistaken for modus tollens. Premise 1, if P then Q. Premise 2, not P. conclusion, therefore not Q. The easiest way, I think, to see why this is a fallacy is if we look at our example again, but plugging it into this particular argument. Premise 1, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. Premise 2, it is not raining. Conclusion, therefore, the ground is not wet. Now think about this for a moment. Is this a good argument? And it probably doesn't take very long to think about it, because clearly it's not a good argument. As both of those premises could be true. As it could be true that if it's raining, then the ground is wet. It could be true that it is not raining. And yet it might be false that the ground is not wet. Or in other words, if that's too many negatives, you could say it might be true that the ground is wet, despite what the conclusion says. And the reason why that could be is that, like, to go back to my earlier example, like, let's say somebody just spilled a bucket of water on the ground, or maybe somebody was just spraying a hose on the ground. Well, in that case, the ground would be wet, and it doesn't have to be raining for that. Like, it could be otherwise a dry day outside, but like somebody's just spilled a bucket of water on the ground. And so in that case, like, both of the premises would be true, but the conclusion would be false. So that's why this is a fallacy. And this fallacy is known as denying the antecedent. That is the label for this fallacy. Seriously, I have to brain blast so hard to remember which one is the fallacy and which the valid one. Yeah, it can be tough at first to keep them straight. I think with me, it just comes from having, like, looked at them so much and just lots and lots of repetition that it kind of becomes more natural. But, like, yeah, there definitely was a time when, like, at first it was a little harder. And I think for everyone, it eventually, yeah, it just takes, like, after enough repetition, it maybe becomes a little more natural, but definitely at first it's tough. So this one, of course, denying the antecedent, because you see there in premise 2, the not P, that rejects or denies the antecedent of the conditional in order to, in the conclusion, reject the consequent. So that's where the mistake lies. And so we call this one denying the antecedent. So yes, very much possible there for the premises to be true, but for the conclusion to be false. Now, earlier I mentioned that validity was certainly one component of evaluating deductive arguments. However, it is not the only one. There is another component which is going to be known as soundness. And I'll say more in a moment about what soundness is, but remember earlier when I was saying that validity is not so much about whether the premises and conclusion are true, but just whether there's this truth-preserving relationship between them? Well, one might wonder, like, okay, like, validity is surely important, but, like, what about just whether the argument, like, is actually getting at a true conclusion? Like, doesn't that matter too? And so that's where soundness comes in. So validity is certainly not all that matters for determining how good an argument is. And so if we want to know whether the premises and conclusion are in fact true in a deductive argument, we need to determine if the argument is sound. And what a sound argument is simply a valid argument whose premises are all true. That's right. So valid argument with true premises, that's all true premises, that is going to be a sound argument. And from that very fact, that very definition of soundness, there's something else we can know about sound arguments. There's something that follows. And what follows is going to be that in any sound argument, the conclusion will be true as well. And again, that just follows from the definition of valid, because valid just means that if the premises are all true, then the conclusion is true as well. And if an argument is sound, well, then the premises are all true, and the argument is valid. So therefore, in a sound argument, the conclusion must be true. Which means, in turn, really there are only two steps for determining if an argument is sound. First, we have to determine, is the argument valid? Because if it's not valid, it's not going to be sound. So at the minimum, the argument has to be valid. That's one necessary condition for being sound. But once we've determined that, like if we've determined that argument is sound, we also have to check then, are the premises true? And if the premises are all true, then we have an argument that is in fact sound. So those two steps, not always easy to do in practice. Sometimes it's easier said than done. But those are the two major steps that must be done to determine if an argument is sound. I'd like to give you some examples now. So here's an example of a sound argument. Premise 1, if something is a tree, then it is a plant. Premise 2, a triangle is not a plant. Conclusion, therefore a triangle is not a tree. Now why do I call this a sound argument? Well, seems to me at least both of the premises are true. Like if something is a tree, then it is a plant. Okay, seems right. The triangle is not a plant. Also seems true. But it's also the case that this argument is valid. It's not just that it has true premises, but it corresponds to one of the valid argument forms that we just looked at, namely modus tollens, right? This is just straightforwardly a modus tollens. Or at least it's very similar in spirit to modus tollens. Like we're just plugging in basically like a triangle for the thing that's not a plant, and then we just say, okay, like triangle's not a tree. So that's one way you might think of this argument, as this kind of, in some way, like parallel pretty much to a modus tollens. Another example of a sound argument is Axaeon is a philosopher VTuber. So, okay, true premise. Second premise, all philosopher VTubers are internet users. Okay, also a true premise, because being a VTuber requires using the internet. Therefore, Axaeon is an internet user. Okay, true premises, valid argument, leads to a true conclusion, so therefore it is a sound argument. And those examples, I take it, are, pretty natural, but really, like, that's the gold standard in an argument, is trying to make, at least if you're putting forth a deductive argument, really what we ultimately aim for is to have arguments that are sound. So whenever you're putting forth your own deductive arguments, I hope that you will be able to put forth ones that are sound. Now, when it comes to arguments, of course, we've already talked a little bit about fallacies. These are mistakes in reasoning. But there are other fallacies too, like but like affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. Those are not the only fallacies there are. There are various kinds of formal and informal fallacies, and I would just like to say a little bit now about some of them, like some of the ones that strike me as especially common, or ones that we especially have to worry about. And the first one that comes to my mind here is ad hominem. Ad hominem. So this is also, just if you want to think about like what that Latin phrase means, just means appeal to the person. And so this fallacy is when we dismiss an argument or a viewpoint by criticizing the person who puts it forth, rather than the argument itself. Just to illustrate what that looks like on a more concrete level, if we just take this example, we should reject Cal's argument for life on other planets. He believes in all kinds of weird stuff. Okay, clearly that would be an ad hominem. And I take it also, like, it's pretty obvious that would not be a good argument, for a reason I'll say more about in a moment. Another example, we can ignore what Laura argues, as she's just a grifter. Okay, also very much an ad hominem there. We're attacking the character or motivations of the person and not attacking the argument itself that they put forth. Now, as for why this is a fallacy, the reason is that somebody could very well be saying something true. They could be putting forth a perfectly good argument, even if they're a bad person, or even if they're usually mistaken about things, or even if they're badly motivated. Like, it might not seem expected, it might be a little surprising, maybe they're just right by luck, or putting forth a good argument by luck. But still, if we really want to judge, like, is the argument that they're putting forth a good one, we need to evaluate the argument on its own merits. We can't just dismiss the argument on the basis that it's being put forth by a speaker that we might not like, or a speaker who might have various character flaws. That's not enough to show that the argument itself is bad. So that is ad hominem, very important fallacy to avoid. Another fallacy is hasty generalization. Now, this is where we conclude something about an entire group based on a very small sample, a sample that is inadequate for drawing that kind of conclusion. Just for an example that is, I think, kind of an extreme one, but one that nevertheless illustrates it very clearly what hasty generalization looks like, is if somebody says, people from this city are so boorish. Remember that guy we met with the awful manners? He's lived here all his life. I rest my case. So they're, again, concluding something about an entire city of people just on the basis of one example. That would certainly be hasty generalization. Or another example of maybe a mix of hasty generalization and wishful thinking. Cats are all super friendly. I know because my cat is always happy to see me. So as much as I would hate to confront anyone about the fallacy this is, I would, if I were being honest with them, have to say, look, this is a hasty generalization. It doesn't follow that all cats are super friendly just because your cat is always happy to see you. It'd be wonderful if it were true. But alas, I think we all know there are, in fact, cats who are not super friendly. The presence of just one cat who is friendly is not enough to show that all of them are. Further fallacy, and this one is also, of course, very easy to think of plenty of examples because it's one that's just abundant in discourse, is appeal to emotion. Appeal to emotion. So this is when you try to persuade someone of something simply by arousing their feelings. And it could be just about any feeling. It could be guilt, could be fear, could be anger, could be pity, could be compassion. But where you just arouse that person's feelings rather than presenting evidence that's relevant to whether your claim is true. That would be appealing to emotion, trying to manipulate people's emotions. And here an example that I really like that also comes from the textbook that I mentioned earlier that I thought I would share, is if somebody says, you should hire me. I'm the best person for the job. If you don't hire me, I won't have money to feed my family, nor to pay for my dog's heart operation. Also, my wife will leave me. I like that he includes, also my wife will leave me as kind of like an aside at the end. Of there's the dog and sure, but also there's my wife. And clearly this is somebody who's, trying to manipulate in this case, the hiring committee's sense of guilt and compassion and pity to take pity on this person, give him a job, hoping that they'll think oh no, if we don't give him the job, we'll be bad people. We need to have a heart and just, we can't let this guy's, we can't make it so this guy's wife leaves him and, he has to have money for his dog's heart operation. We got to hire this guy. That's clearly what the person is hoping for. But nevertheless, it is a fallacy that they are engaging in. I will say, though, I think I have more respect for appeal to emotion than some of the other fallacies, if only because executing an appeal to emotion well, I think requires a certain skill that's maybe not quite as much the case. The other fallacies, at least sometimes, are just kind of sheer carelessness. But sometimes for a well-executed appeal to emotion, it can take a certain rhetorical skill. So I do find it tough to not have a certain level of respect for that. That doesn't make it any less of a fallacy, so it is something we should try to avoid. And, an important clarification about appeal to emotion is, and it's really important not to misunderstand this, because the claim being made here is not that, you should never have any emotion present when you're making an argument. It's fine to feel emotional about something. It's fine for the people who are listening to you to have emotions about it. But the issue like when it becomes an issue, when it becomes a fallacy, is when there's nothing but emotion. So the key is, like, even if it is an emotionally laden issue or it's something that you feel strongly about, just make sure that the emotion is accompanied by good evidence for your claim. As long as that's the case, and as long as what you're putting forth in support of your claim, like the reasons behind your claim are the evidence and not the emotions, then there's no fallacy present. It's only when the emotions are replacing the evidence that it becomes a fallacy. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about, and actually I believe this is the last major section of today's talk. We are drawing closer to the end. But I would like to talk for a little bit, chat, about some tips for productive discussions. And if you're wondering, like, what does this have to do with critical thinking? Well, the answer is that I think critical thinking is something that is often done in dialogue with others. It often takes place through debates, through discussing things with others. And so it's important when it comes to just being able to think critically well. It's important to be able to take part in discussions well, to be a good faith discussant. And there are certain practices that really help with that. And one of them is to make sure not to strawman your opponents. Strawmanning being another fallacy. And what that fallacy is when you distort or weaken or oversimplify another person's position in order to make it easier for you to attack. So this is a really bad thing to do if you're trying to host a serious discussion with somebody. Another way of putting strawmanning, if you just like to think of it this way, is like if somebody, like your interlocutor, puts forth claim X, well, if you then reinterpret it so that it becomes the weak or absurd claim Y, like where claim Y is just not nearly as plausible as claim X, and then you attack claim Y, but conclude that claim X is unfounded, well, then you have engaged in strawmanning, where it's called strawmanning because you've set up a straw man, so to speak, where instead of like an actual flesh and blood person, a straw man like is easy to knock down. And so, yeah, like you might have knocked down that straw man, but like you haven't really engaged with the argument that your opponent was making. And this one is also super common. So here's an example of straw manning. If somebody says, people should use the cart corral more, that's after they get groceries. People should use the cart corral more. I don't think it's good when people just leave their carts haphazardly in the parking lot. Person 2, so you're saying it should be against the law. Like, no, clearly not. Like, the person 1 did not say that at all. Like, just because you think something is bad to do doesn't mean that you think it should be illegal. Like, those are two very different claims. So person 2 in this example is strawmanning person 1. And if you want to have productive discussions with someone, yeah, like it's really important that you actually engage with the claims that they are making and not some reinterpreted, weakened, absurd claims that you might like to imagine that they're making. Tip number 2, very closely related to tip number 1, is be charitable in your interpretations of others. Where being charitable means anytime there's any ambiguity in what someone says, anytime it's open to interpretation, what somebody means by a given claim, try to interpret it in such a way that it comes out as strong or as interesting or as challenging or as plausible as possible. Like if you have 2 possible interpretations and one of them makes the claim seem a lot more reasonable than the other one is, just by default, go with the interpretation that makes the claim sound more reasonable, rather than the one that makes it come out less reasonable. So this is the opposite of strawmanning. It's when you make sure to be charitable to your opponents. And the reason why it's good to be charitable, I mean, really, there are a few reasons. One of them is just that for people that you're talking to in a philosophical discussion, like very often or even typically, like these will be people who are, fairly smart. These are, it's really rare to, I'm actually reluctant in general just to say like, oh, that person's stupid. I think that in general, like even if somebody is mistaken in a view they have, like they often have like some reasons for it. And so it just makes sense to think like, okay, if we're not sure exactly why this person thinks a certain thing or what they mean by this, like probably they mean the more reasonable thing. Just interpreting agents, interpreting thinkers charitably just seems to give us a more accurate picture in most cases of what people are actually thinking. But also, like just even like regardless of that, setting that first point aside, it tends to make discussions go better. It tends to make discussions more interesting if you focus on the charitable interpretation of what your opponent is saying. Because like if you can knock down like a relatively uninteresting or implausible version of their view, like that doesn't really show that much. But what shows a lot, and I think what is the most philosophically intriguing, is if you consider like, okay, like what's the most plausible version of this view? Like what's the strongest or like the best or the interpretation that makes their view come out as like having the best showing possible? And is that view true? Is the view true under that interpretation? And like if it is great, and if it's not, like that's really interesting because now you've shown that like even the most plausible version of the view is not true. And that just is a much more philosophically engaging and interesting discussion to have when people interpret each other charitably than when they don't. So that is why I make that recommendation. Tip number 3, when you're, especially like if it's a debate and like you disagree with somebody about something, I would say it's extra important to try to understand the other person's position in at least as much depth as you understand your own. So don't just think about like arguments for your own view. Don't just try to like amass a bunch of support for your view without looking into like why the other side thinks what they do. But instead, like really like try to listen to your opponent deeply and consider like, okay, what might the reasons for this view be? Like maybe in your own time too, like in your own time, you can look up more about why someone might believe that opposing view, you know, why they might not be inclined to your view. And that tends to help the discussion go better. John Stuart Mill once said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that," which is a wonderful classic philosophy quotation. And if you're curious about John Stuart Mill, there he is. So I still have the picture of him in OBS from one of my Halloween streams. So there he is, John Stuart Mill. And his thought here is that like to really fully grasp the intricacies of a position, it's necessary to know like what challenges there are to it, like what the opposing positions are and what might be said for them. Because if you don't even know that, then really you're not going to have a good understanding of just what the case for your view is, how strong, how well your case holds up, how well your view holds up against other views. So knowing other people's positions in detail is very important to having good, productive discussions. And then what I believe is the final tip for productive discussions that I will offer is that if you're discussing someone and you disagree with them about something, try as much as possible to keep the discussion focused on the issue that you disagree about and not on the person that you disagree with. And so like, especially if you find yourself feeling tempted to disparage the other person or their side personally, like to make a personal attack on them, that pretty much always leads a discussion to, you know, go south very quickly. And like at that point, there's a sense in which you've kind of lost already if it's a debate and you just start resorting to personal attacks. And so it can be tempting. Sometimes it can be difficult not to fall into that, but still like try as much as possible to keep the issue focused on like, okay, what is the claim that we disagree about? What is the evidence for it? And that will make the discussions much more productive. I think one way people can sometimes fall short of this is, especially like if they start to speculate about hidden motivations that the other person might have for believing their view. Like if somebody says, oh, like you only think this because like such and such feature of your background, or only because like, you don't care about such and such group of people. That almost never helps a discussion. It almost always takes the discussion from what might have been philosophically interesting territory into just the very low space of, making personal attacks and psychologizing and, uncharitable mind reading. And so that's not good. We should always try to avoid that in our discussions. So again, just to kind of reiterate something there that I touched on maybe a bit earlier, but to put it more explicitly, the thought here is not that like you can't ever feel frustrated in a discussion. Like it's fine to sometimes feel frustrated. I sometimes feel frustrated when I am discussing something with someone else. But I do think that insofar as one can still like persevere through it and keep an issues-oriented focus, I think that that's really the key to keeping the discussion productive in spite of whatever frustration one might feel. Though I know sometimes it's easier said than done. If you're curious to read more about any of these topics, because of course, today's session was really just a brief introduction. There's a lot more that could be said about all of these. Here are some critical thinking textbooks that I have used some examples from in the course of this talk. One of them is by Lewis Vaughan called The Power of Critical Thinking. And then there's a further one by Jack Lyons and Barry Ward called The New Critical Thinking, an empirically informed introduction. There might be new versions of these books now, so the newest versions, the covers might look a little bit different, but at least for one of the somewhat recent versions, that was what these books looked like. But that is some potential further reading if there's any of this that you'd like to follow up on. And so yeah, chat, now that we are sort of at the end, if you have any questions, feel free to post them. I'll stick around for a little bit if people want to ask about anything. For those of you who are heading out now, in case I miss you, I just want to say thank you and happy thinking. It was really good having you all here in today's stream. So with that in mind, let us go back to my main space. So yeah, if anybody has any thoughts that they want to post about critical thinking, or like things you're still wondering about critical thinking, like hey, what was that thing Axaeon was talking about? Or if there are any parts you want me to go back to, let me know. While you're maybe typing that and thinking about that, I will also say for my part that yeah, philosophy I think has helped me more than anything else when it comes to critical thinking, and I think I would not be the thinker I am today if I did not study philosophy. So I'm really glad that I've had the chance to study it for as long as I have. Tia, oh yeah, thanks for the stream, Max. Hope to see you tomorrow. Yeah, you will see me tomorrow. By the way, I don't know if, well, how do I put this? Tia, if you would like me to make an announcement to those present about what you have going on tomorrow, let me know and I can. But if you would rather I not say anything about it, then that's fine too, and I won't. But if you would like me to do a little promotion on your part here, I'm absolutely happy to do that. It was fun. I expected a bit more of the judging, acceptability, and relevance stuff, but kind of forgot we need to start with logic. Yeah, I think that for the stuff on acceptability, relevance, also the stuff on inductive arguments, you're right that there's a lot there that we could cover. Yeah, for today's stream, it was more of just kind of getting at the foundational elements of like the logic and so on. But I'm thinking at some point in the future, I might do like an actual logic and critical thinking class through a series of streams. And if I do end up doing that at some point, then yeah, certainly that will be much more comprehensive. Do you feel that fallacies can be useful to convincing less educated people? Like, should you avoid fallacies if it's one of the only ways to get a point across? Yeah, I mean, so that's also a really good question, Stabby, because I think sometimes, and I have been in this situation before myself where I've been talking about something with someone and it seemed to me that like there was a good argument that I could make to them, but where that good argument like had a lot of moving parts and was kind of maybe tricky to understand and maybe tricky to articulate. But like it was a decent, like really like solid argument. Whereas on the other hand, like I could have gone with a much simpler, like, or even like fallacious argument, but where the person I was talking to like probably would have bought it, or at least would have had like a higher chance of buying the fallacious argument than the less good argument. I am proud to say I do not recall any situations like that where I've gone with the fallacious argument. I think in all those cases I have nevertheless striven to give what seemed to me like the best argument. And yeah, I think in the end, like there are certainly cases where maybe just giving a certain fallacy might be the most rhetorically powerful option and might make the most impact on like what another person thinks. So that seems right to me. I still think that even in those cases, one should avoid the fallacy and just as a matter of intellectual honesty should put forth the better argument. And that's because, well, I mean, I guess that's for maybe a few reasons, but part of it is that just like, even if in the short term, somebody accepts an argument that I give, like only because like it's a fallacious argument and I just realized like, hey, here's like an easy fallacious argument that is rhetorically powerful that like I can use that's going to convince this person. I think any acceptance of that kind is probably going to be somewhat fragile. Like that is, if I get them to think something like that based on a fallacy, someone else could come along and point out the fallacy, and then they might no longer, the person who originally believed my claim might no longer believe it, and they might think like, oh, okay, now like Axaeon is just somebody who bandies about fallacies. So now maybe they'll find me like a less trustworthy interlocutor than they might otherwise have. So I think that path, and I know you're not saying anything to the contrary, you were just putting it forth as a question, but I think if somebody were to sort of advocate that path of sort of strategically using fallacies in discussions like this, to me that would seem a little short-sighted. And I think, yeah, the best thing is just to try to make the strongest argument possible, even if it might not have as good a chance of convincing someone in the moment. That's just my own view, though. Sure, waiting moves up. It will go up soon. Okay, yeah, thank you for letting me know that, Tia. So everyone gathered here, Tia Fair has a very special event tomorrow. Very important event. And that event is her debut. That's right. We have another philosopher VTuber joining us. No longer will it be just me and Karis. Tia Fair is joining us as the newest philosopher VTuber here on YouTube. And I'm just going to check my calendar because I think I have the timing here. It looks like, well, I don't know if the time has changed, but I know at one point, Tia, you said at looks like 3 p.m. Eastern time would be the time you're thinking of for that. So anyway, for anybody who wants to see Tia's debut and support her, definitely go to her channel and see her debut tomorrow. I will be there and I'm greatly looking forward to it. So best of luck, Tia. I know you'll do great. I see these classes will be regular. It kind of sounds like, yeah, I'm thinking of like doing like an ethics class at some point, an epistemology class, probably a philosophy of religion class. Some of those are a bit farther away than others, but like these are classes that I've taught before in person, and I think it would be kind of cool to translate them to the sort of VTuber sphere. So I am looking forward to getting to share those with everyone. Axaeon, heartbroken and despairing over the fate of humanity after opening Twitter, has decided he must take matters unto his own hands and teach the people the skill of critical thinking. I mean, basically, yeah. I can't deny it. I love a good grandiose way of putting something like that. So thank you, Taraditto, for the wonderful way of putting it. It can be tricky sometimes because I do like to think that I am someone who's intelligent and that I have certain insights that could help the world if I shared them. It's difficult to say something like that, though, without coming across as arrogant in a way, without coming across as conceited. And it just makes me feel like, well, I guess I have mixed feelings about it. Because on one hand, I think, okay, like maybe it's easy to worry about that when putting forth the thought that like one has things to teach people. But on the other hand, maybe I shouldn't feel that way, you know? Maybe it would be better if I just didn't care and was like, yeah, yeah, I'm a really smart person and I can, you know, help teach people things like this, like critical thinking. I think that kind of claim, that kind of aspiration is something like anybody who wants to be in any kind of teaching position has to, at some level, acknowledge. And so I think that maybe while in some ways our culture is one that favors like a certain modesty and like not coming across as like bragging about one's own abilities, I think, yeah, just to be honest about one's own dreams and one's own aspirations, like at some level you do have to acknowledge that there are things that you think you can help people do better at. And I guess in my case, that is thinking. Which is not to say that I'm perfect at it, of course. Like I make all kinds of mistakes when it comes to thinking. And I'm sure right now that many of the beliefs that I have are in fact false. And I think that is strongly supported just by the fact that there's so much disagreement in philosophy. So disagreement about, or disagreement among people who are equally as smart, if not much smarter in some cases than I am, and who have looked into the issues as much as I have, if not much more than I have. I think it really would be arrogant to think that I found the truth about everything. But I think one thing that's cool is even if I haven't found the truth, I do think I can still help people by sort of inspiring them to think deeply about things. Whether their conclusions about those things ultimately agree with mine or not, my interest is more just in helping people to reflect on things deeply. Having that doubt is usually a good thing, better than being confidently flawed. Yeah, I like that way of putting it. Thank you, Stabby Stabby. I do think having that impulse to doubt, that impulse to second guess myself will probably always be a part of me. And maybe it's for the best that it is, you know? Maybe that's simply a reflection of an acknowledgement of the difficulty of the issues. Maybe that certain epistemic humility is something that we will always need to embrace. So once again, thank you everybody for tuning in today's stream. I really enjoyed getting to talk about logic with you and critical thinking and reasoning. And I look forward to more streams like this in the future where we get to dive into some of these issues a bit more. I think for right now, I'm going to head out and give my voice a break and maybe work on some other things. But in the meantime, yeah, I'm not sure yet what I'll be streaming next week. Probably tomorrow I'll decide on a schedule for next week's streams and for videos coming up. But whatever you end up doing with the rest of your evening, I hope that you have a wonderful time with it. Whether it's more philosophical reflection or giving your brain a break, or maybe even just like sleeping, because we all need sleep eventually. But I hope you have a great rest of the evening, and I will see you all again very soon. Again, thanks for stopping by. I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.